So picture a brightly lit laboratory. It's in Leverkusen, Germany, and the year is 1936.
Right before everything in the world basically changes.
Exactly. And there's this chemist, Gerhard Schrader. He's leaning over a workbench, carefully mixing this cocktail of phosphorus and cyanide.
Which, I mean, sounds like a terrible idea right off the bat.
Oh, absolutely. But his goal is actually entirely noble. He's just trying to invent a synthetic pesticide, to save global wheat harvests from being completely devoured by weevils and aphids.
He was literally trying to secure the human food supply.
Right. But as he's adjusting his equipment, just this single microscopic bead of the liquid he just synthesized falls onto the bench top.
Just a tiny drop.
Just a drop. And within seconds, he says the room seems to dim. His pupils constrict down to the size of pinpricks. He starts gasping for air, and his chest tightens up as if it's wrapped in iron bands.
Yeah, the physical reaction is instantaneous.
He breaks out in this profound sweat. His vision starts tunneling, and he gets dizzy to the point of just collapsing. He didn't know it yet, but he hadn't just invented a bug spray. He had just brought the world's first nerve gas into existence.
And that terrifying physical reaction, like the constricted pupils and the respiratory failure, that was his own nervous system essentially short-circuiting in real time.
It's terrifying.
It really is. Schrader spent weeks bedridden, just recovering from that single accidental exposure. He set out to save crops, and instead, he handed the military a weapon of mass destruction.
Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're starting with what looks, at first glance, like a triumphant list of human achievements.
On paper, yeah, it looks incredible.
We're exploring the history of monumental medical and scientific breakthroughs. We're looking at how humanity learned to treat devastating diseases, how we figured out ways to protect troops in extreme environments, and how we conquered agricultural pests.
It really is a story of profound progress. I mean, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources today. We've got declassified military reports on chemical warfare research, historical documentation of the 20th century pharmaceutical industry.
Which is a wild read on its own.
Oh, completely. Plus, we have exhaustive medical analyses from the Nuremberg trials and the groundbreaking archival research of Paul Weinling, who literally spent years tracking down the victims of unethical science.
And when you lay all these documents out on a table, the initial mission of the scientists involved seems so, purely good.
Right, curing malaria, creating typhus vaccines.
Exactly. Developing insecticides so people don't starve to death. Finding ways for pilots to survive bailing out over the freezing ocean. It starts out sounding like the ultimate innocent mission, just brilliant minds working late into the night to save humanity.
But as we comb through these archives and actually trace the origins of the data that fills our modern medical textbooks, a really profound shift happens.
The dark undercurrent.
Yeah, the goals were heroic, but we have to slowly unpack how this vital data was actually gathered. Because the data that eventually saved millions of lives wasn't always gathered from, willing volunteers in sterile, ethically pristine clinics.
It was extracted.
It was extracted from individuals who gave absolutely no consent.
People who were stripped of their rights under authoritarian control. People bound by service to their countries. And people locked in cages.
Today is really the story of the invisible pioneers who bore the physical cost of our modern scientific knowledge.
So let's go back to Gerhard Schrader in 1936, because his story perfectly encapsulates how the line between a noble pursuit and a total nightmare can just vanish.
Right, so Schrader was working for Bayer, which was a subsidiary of the massive IG Farben chemical conglomerate. And the global mandate at the time was incredibly practical.
The population was growing, right?
Exactly. The world population was growing, and agricultural pests were just a relentless threat. Germany desperately needed to secure its food supply. So Schrader's task was to find a cheap, effective, and synthetic chemical that would kill insects but remain safe enough for farmers to spray on crops.
And he started experimenting with organophosphates.
He did. And we really need to pause here and explain what an organophosphate actually does, because that is the absolute key to this entire horror story.
Yeah, why was this chemical so uniquely devastating to him when that single drop hit his desk?
Okay, so it comes down to a specific enzyme in the body called acetylcholinesterase.
Acetylcholinesterase.
Right. Think of your nervous system as this vast network of electrical wires. When your brain tells your muscle to move, it sends a chemical messenger called acetylcholine across the gap between the nerve and the muscle.
Okay, so the brain sends the messenger.
Yes. That messenger turns the muscle on, which causes it to contract.
So acetylcholine is basically the chemical switch that flexes the muscle.
Precisely. But here's the catch. Once the muscle flexes, you need to turn the switch off, or the muscle will just stay clamped shut forever.
Which sounds painful.
It's lethal. So that is what acetylcholinesterase does. It sweeps into the gap, clears out the acetylcholine, and allows the muscle to relax.
Got it. It's the cleanup crew.
Exactly. Organophosphates completely destroy that cleanup crew. They destroy the off switch.
Wow. So if the off switch is broken, the brain just keeps screaming at the muscles to flex over and over again incredibly rapidly.
And that doesn't just mean your arm twitches. It means your diaphragm, which is the muscle that controls your breathing spasms violently and locks up.
Oh, God.
Your secretory glands go into overdrive, filling your lungs with fluid. You essentially drown in your own secretions while suffocating from respiratory paralysis.
That's horrifying.
It is. The exact same biochemical mechanism that causes a little weevil to spasm and die on a wheat stalk does the exact same thing to a human being, just on a larger scale.
Which is exactly why Schrader's company immediately realized this compound was way too lethal to be sold to farmers.
Right.
But, and here's the crazy part, they didn't destroy the formula. They handed it right over to the German military.
Naturally.
Yeah. The military took this agricultural failure over to a specialized poison gas development department at the Spandau Citadel. They weaponized it, and they named it Taboon.
And for his trouble, Schrader received a massive bonus of 50,000 rice marks.
He essentially monetized the end of the world.
He really did. But the historical complexity here is that he didn't stop there. He kept trying to fulfill his original agricultural mission.
Right. He was still looking for bug spray.
Exactly. But by 1938, he synthesized an even more potent nerve agent. Initially, they called it Substance 146, but we know it today as sarin.
Sarin gas. Wow.
Yeah, and a decade later, he synthesized cyclosarin.
Yet, amid all this literally apocalyptic chemistry, he actually achieved his goal too. He successfully created the first organic insecticide, TEPP.
And his research group later synthesized parathion, which became one of the most widely used agricultural pesticides on the entire planet.
It's just wild. It illustrates the intrinsic double edge of scientific research back then. I mean, the molecular difference between saving a harvest and gassing a city is terrifyingly slim.
It really is. And in the context of the 1930s and 40s, scientific advancement was increasingly viewed not just as an academic pursuit, it was a patriotic duty.
You had to deliver.
The state demanded results, whether it was to feed the nation or arm the military.
And that pressure to deliver results for the state brings us to the other massive crisis of the era. Fast forward to World War II. The Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific theater erupts.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the Allies are fighting this massive war in tropical jungles, and they hit a logistical wall that threatens to end the war before it even really gets going.
Malaria.
Malaria.
Yeah.
The Japanese military strategy actually included intentionally cutting off the Allied supply of quinine.
Which was derived from the bark of the cinchona tree in places like Java.
Oh.
And quinine was really the only effective treatment for malaria at the time.
So without it, the Allies were completely defenseless against the mosquitoes.
To understand the panic, we really need to look at what malaria actually does to a human body. Because people hear malaria and they think, oh, it's just a bad tropical flu.
Right, you get a fever, you get better.
Not at all. Malaria is caused by a microscopic parasite called Plasmodium. And this parasite is injected directly into your bloodstream by the bite of an infected Anopheles mosquito.
Okay.
The parasite travels straight to your liver, where it just quietly multiplies for a week or two. You don't even know it's there. Then it bursts out of the liver and invades your red blood cells.
The very cells responsible for carrying oxygen to your brain and your organs.
Yes. The parasites consume the inside of the red blood cells, they multiply again, and then they cause the cells to literally burst open all at once.
All at the same time.
It's synchronized. This cellular explosion dumps toxins and more parasites into the bloodstream, triggering a violently extreme immune response.
Wow.
This is why malaria patients experience these terrifying cyclical attacks. They suffer bone-shaking chills, followed by raging fevers, profuse sweating, and profound anemia.
I can't imagine trying to fight a war like that.
You couldn't. In the jungles of the South Pacific, this disease could decimate a battalion way faster than enemy artillery ever could.
So the military realized that if they couldn't treat malaria, they would lose the Pacific War. It wasn't a possibility, it was a mathematical certainty.
Absolutely.
So the U.S. government initiates what is essentially a medical Manhattan Project. They start throwing massive resources into testing thousands of experimental chemical compounds, just desperately trying to find a synthetic cure or a prophylactic.
It was a frantic process of scientific trial and error. They were synthesizing endless variations of anti-malarial compounds, just hoping to find the molecular magic bullet.
They needed something that would kill the Plasmodium parasite without killing the soldier.
Right. But here's the problem. You can't test a malaria drug in a beaker.
Right, you can't just put it in a test tube.
No, you can't just drop a chemical on a petri dish of parasites and assume it will work in a human being. The human liver metabolizes things differently. The stomach acids change the chemistry.
So to know if a drug works,
You need to see how it reacts inside a living human body that is actively fighting a severe, life-threatening infection.
which presents a monumental logistical and ethical hurdle. Because where do you find thousands of perfectly healthy people who are willing to let you intentionally infect them with a potentially fatal tropical disease?
Just so you can test highly toxic, completely unproven chemicals on them.
Exactly. And this is where the noble mission of saving the troops takes a very, very dark turn. Because the researchers needed bodies. And they found them in places where the concept of a volunteer is a legal fiction at best.
They found their test subjects in the American prison system.
The archival records detail how this massive U.S. malaria project basically set up shop at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois.
And the methodology of these experiments is just visceral. The researchers brought in cages of Anopheles mosquitoes that had been specifically bred and intentionally infected with the malaria parasite.
Think about that. They're bringing cages of infected mosquitoes into a prison. The inmates were brought into a room, and they were required to press their arms against the mesh of the cages.
Or sometimes they let the researchers place the mosquitoes directly onto their skin in these little jars.
Just allowing themselves to be bitten and infected.
One of the most famous accounts of this comes from Nathan Leopold.
Wait, of the Leopold and Loeb murder case?
The exact same one. He was an inmate at Stateville, and he actually participated in these trials. His descriptions of the disease's progression are just harrowing.
What did he say it was like?
He talked about headaches so severe it felt as if his skull was physically splitting open. He described how the chills would violently shake the heavy metal prison beds, like literally rattling the entire cell block.
That's insane. The fevers would spike to 107 degrees. Leopold described the inmates saturating their thin prison mattresses with sweat, just caught in this agonizing cycle of freezing and boiling as their red blood cells continually ruptured.
And that was merely the baseline. That was just the disease.
Yeah.
Once the inmates were deathly ill, that's when the experimental pharmacology began.
Because they had to test the new drugs.
Exactly. And because the researchers were operating strictly by trial and error, the dosing was often wildly inaccurate.
So sometimes they didn't get enough.
Sometimes the experimental drug did absolutely nothing, and the inmate was just left to suffer the full, unmitigated wrath of malaria. But other times, the drug itself proved far more dangerous than the disease.
The military reports document one specific experimental compound they tried, called the Santochin analog. The side effects were catastrophic.
It was brutal.
It caused severe full-body hives, excruciating nausea, and just endless debilitating vomiting. And in some bizarre cases, the chemical toxicity was so profound that it literally bleached the inmate's hair completely white.
To understand how this was allowed to happen, we really have to look at the societal framing of incarceration during the 1940s.
How did people justify this?
Well, prisoners were legally and socially viewed as individuals who had forfeited their bodily autonomy. They were seen as citizens in deficit. Participating in these highly dangerous, potentially lethal experiments was explicitly marketed to them and to the public as a way to repay their debt to society.
It was framed as an act of profound patriotism. I was actually looking at a magazine article from 1963 that praised inmates at an Atlanta penitentiary for waging a battle against malaria.
The media love it.
They painted them as soldiers on the home front. The logic was, well, if the boys in the Pacific were taking bullets, the boys in Stateville could take a few mosquito bites.
But that framing completely ignores the immense mechanisms of coercion at play. It wasn't just abstract patriotism motivating these men. It was raw, unadulterated financial desperation.
Money.
Exactly. The records show that inmates at the Maryland House of Correction were earning $2 a day for participating in medical trials.
Which, I mean, it doesn't sound like much now. But in a 1940s prison economy, where you might earn just pennies a week stamping license plates, $2 a day is a massive fortune.
It's life-changing inside those walls.
It buys better food, tobacco, safety, and just a slightly better standard of living inside a brutal environment.
And the coercion becomes even more explicit when we examine the dermatological experiments at Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania.
Oh, this one is rough.
It is. This was run by Dr. Albert Kligman. Now, Klickman is a towering figure in dermatology. His research at Holmesburg eventually led to the invention of Retin-A.
Which is that revolutionary acne and anti-aging cream that is still prescribed globally today. Almost everyone knows someone who has used it.
Absolutely. But when you read Klickman's own accounts of entering that prison, it sends a shiver down your spine.
What did he say?
He didn't see men. He didn't see patients. He famously wrote that when he looked at the inmates, he saw acres of skin.
Acres of skin.
He viewed the prison population as this vast, captive landscape of biological material, just waiting to be harvested for data.
And many of the subjects at Holmesburg were unsentenced prisoners. These were men who had merely been accused of a crime and were sitting in jail solely because they couldn't afford to pay bail.
That's the part that really highlights the coercion. The researchers recognized this desperation, and they weaponized it.
They used the monetary compensation from the experiments as leverage.
Yes. They knew these men were desperate to buy their freedom, so they offered them cash to endure agonizing skin tests, punch biopsies, and exposure to highly toxic chemicals, including dioxin.
Which is incredibly toxic. I have to challenge the language often used in these historical reports. The word volunteer is constantly thrown around.
It's a very loaded word in this context.
Right, because if I am locked in a cage, presumed innocent but unable to afford bail, and someone wearing a white lab coat offers me the literal key to my cell in exchange for letting them burn my skin with experimental chemicals, that is not volunteering.
Not even close.
That is a transaction negotiated under extreme duress. The illusion of choice is just paper thin.
You are entirely correct. The power dynamic completely negates the possibility of true consent. And this paternalistic view of incarcerated bodies, it extended deeply into surgical experimentation as well.
Right. Let's talk about San Quentin.
Consider Dr. Leo Stanley. He served as the chief surgeon at San Quentin Prison in California from 1913 all the way to 1951.
That's a long tenure.
It is. And Stanley was a staunch, vocal proponent of eugenics.
Eugenics being the deeply flawed, racist pseudoscience that claimed human traits like criminality, poverty, and intelligence were purely genetic and could be bred out of the population.
Exactly. Stanley fully believed that criminality was a biological disease caused by weakened endocrine systems. He theorized that older men committed crimes because they lacked testosterone, and that restoring their vitality would somehow cure their criminal tendencies.
So he decided to fix their hormones
By performing testicular implants on the inmates.
The details of this read like a gothic horror novel. Stanley would literally harvest testicles from younger prisoners who had just been executed by the state.
Straight from the execution chamber.
And he would surgically implant them into the abdomens or scrotums of living, older inmates. He claimed it would rejuvenate them.
It's just bizarre science.
And when he inevitably ran out of executed humans to harvest from, he didn't stop. He started using the testicles of rams, goats, and boars.
Stanley's decades of work at San Quentin really highlight the absolute, unchecked power the state held over incarcerated bodies.
They could do whatever they wanted.
Yeah. He wasn't treating these men for illnesses they actually possessed. He was using them as a raw resource to test his sociological theories about crime control. He was trying to biologically engineer obedience.
It's astounding that this happened in California into the 1950s. But as horrifying as the prison experiments are, you could theoretically argue that these were at least adult men who nominally signed a piece of paper, even if the financial and physical coercion was immense.
Right, they were adults.
But when you look deeper into the sources, the net of test subjects was cast far wider. The researchers moved beyond the prisons and targeted populations who couldn't even speak for themselves.
Yes. The history of medical experimentation in the United States routinely exploited the absolute most vulnerable demographics imaginable. We're talking about orphans, the mentally disabled, and the sick.
And the justification was always the same.
The pursuit of knowledge requires raw material.
Put yourself in the shoes of a parent in 1896. You bring your sick child to a prestigious Boston hospital. You expect the doctors to do everything in their power to heal your child.
That's the basic social contract of medicine.
But the records show that a Dr. Arthur Wentworth decided to perform lumbar punctures spinal taps on 29 young children without ever informing their parents or asking for permission.
And we need to clarify what a spinal tap actually entails, especially back in the 1890s.
It's not a minor procedure.
Not at all. It involves inserting a long, hollow needle directly between the vertebrae of the lower spine to draw out cerebrospinal fluid. It is an incredibly painful, invasive procedure that carries significant risks of infection and nerve damage.
And Dr. Wentworth didn't do this because the children needed it for a diagnosis.
No. He did it simply because he wanted to see if the procedure itself was harmful. He used the children as human crash test dummies.
The utter disregard for the individual is staggering. And it wasn't an isolated incident. In 1908, researchers in Philadelphia went into an orphanage and deliberately infected dozens of children with tuberculin.
Right, tuberculin is a protein extract from the bacteria that causes tuberculosis. They were testing diagnostic methods.
But they didn't ask the orphans.
They couldn't.
Yeah.
And the researchers didn't view the orphans as patients. They literally referred to the children in their published medical journal articles as the material used.
The material.
Yeah. The tuberculin experiments caused excruciating eye inflammation, and the records indicate that several of the orphan children were permanently blinded as a result.
They blinded orphans to write a research paper.
It's truly horrific.
Or look at Dr. Frank Crozer-Knowles in 1909. There was an outbreak of a virus called molluscum contagiosum at an orphanage.
Which is a highly contagious viral infection. It causes these raised, pearl-like lesions and warts all over the skin. It's really uncomfortable and very easily spread.
A normal doctor would see the outbreak and immediately try to quarantine and treat the children.
That would be the ethical response.
But Dr. Knowles did the exact opposite. He intentionally took the virus from the infected children and deliberately rubbed it into the skin of two perfectly healthy orphans.
Just infected them on purpose.
Yes. Why? Just so he could watch the disease progress from day one. He admitted in his own publication that the pathology of the disease was already thoroughly understood by the medical community. He didn't learn anything new, he just wanted to watch it happen, and he used healthy orphans as his blank canvas.
And this exploitation of wards of the state, it continued well into the mid-20th century. If we look at the Sonoma State Hospital in California between 1955 and 1960, we see the exact same pattern.
What was Sonoma State?
It was a massive facility where families who were often overwhelmed and lacking support would leave children with severe cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and other developmental disorders.
So these were children who couldn't communicate, couldn't advocate for themselves, and were entirely at the mercy of the medical staff.
Completely. And the state-appointed researchers subjected these disabled children to highly painful pneumoencephalograms.
What is that?
It involves draining cerebrospinal fluid and actually injecting air directly into the brain so it shows up clearer on an X-ray.
That sounds excruciating.
It is. They also did routine spinal taps, none of which provided any therapeutic benefit to the child. And perhaps most chillingly, the hospital records reveal a systematic harvesting program.
The brain harvesting.
Yes. The brain of virtually every child with cerebral palsy who died at that facility during those 5 years was removed during autopsy and sent to research laboratories, entirely without parental knowledge or consent.
When you read these accounts, it just forces you to ask, where was the ethical boundary? If a respected physician can rationalize intentionally blinding an orphan or harvesting the brain of a disabled child because it might yield a useful data point, they've stopped being healers.
They've lost the plot entirely.
They have abstracted humanity to the point where a child is just a variable in an equation.
That is the ultimate failure of the utilitarian mindset. The individual's humanity is completely erased by the perceived greater good of scientific progress. And this cold utilitarian math wasn't just applied to prisoners and orphans. It was heavily applied to the very soldiers the military claimed it was trying to protect.
Right. You would think that enlisted men wearing the uniform of their country would be afforded the highest level of care.
You'd hope so.
But the declassified files on the Edgewood Arsenal experiments shatter that illusion entirely. Between 1955 and 1975, the U.S. Army subjected roughly 6,720 of its own soldiers to experiments involving over 250 different highly toxic chemicals.
The context of the Cold War is vital to understanding the panic that drove this. The U.S. military establishment was absolutely terrified of Soviet advancements in chemical and biological warfare.
They felt they were falling behind.
They felt an existential need to understand exactly how these agents worked on human physiology. And they were desperately trying to develop non-lethal, incapacitating agents that could neutralize an enemy without killing them.
So they turned their own soldiers into guinea pigs. They exposed them to nerve agents, extreme irritants, and powerful psychochemicals like LSD and BZ.
And BZ is particularly terrifying. Its chemical name is quincuclidinyl benzylate. It is an incredibly potent anticholinergic deliriant.
How does it compare to LSD?
Well, unlike LSD, which causes hallucinations but usually leaves the user aware that they are on a drug, BZ completely blocks the acetylcholine receptors in the brain. It plunges the victim into a state of profound, terrifying delirium.
They lose their minds completely.
The soldiers exposed to BZ lost all contact with reality. They experienced phantom conversations, severe paranoia, and violent, uncontrollable behaviors that lasted for days, all followed by significant memory loss.
And the ethical oversight for these experiments was virtually non-existent. The soldiers were just vaguely told they were testing equipment or helping the war effort.
There was no informed consent.
None. They were exposed to these mind-altering, deeply traumatizing chemicals, observed for a few days, and then essentially tossed back into the regular ranks. The military planned absolutely no long-term follow-up care for these 6,700 men.
The exact same logic drove Project Whitecoat. The military needed to understand biological weapons, so they recruited 2,200 Seventh-day Adventists.
Why them specifically?
Because their religion forbade them from bearing arms, so they served as conscientious objectors, often working as medics. The military brought them to Fort Detrick and intentionally exposed them to weaponized airborne pathogens, most notably Q fever.
Q fever is caused by the bacteria Coxiella burnetii. It's a brutal infection. It causes high fevers, severe pneumonia, and can lead to long-term chronic fatigue and heart valve infections.
This is a serious pathogen.
And the military wanted to see exactly how quickly the bacteria incapacitated a human being, so they literally strapped masks onto these young men and made them inhale weaponized bioaerosols.
The rationale was always national security, we have to know. But the betrayal of trust reached its absolute peak when we look at the government-funded radiation and cancer experiments of the mid-20th century.
This one is hard to even believe.
Between 1960 and 1971, the Department of Defense wanted to know how much radiation a soldier could absorb on a nuclear battlefield before becoming combat ineffective.
To get this data, they funded researchers who targeted civilian hospital patients, primarily poor, Black individuals who were already suffering from terminal cancer.
The doctors told these desperate patients that they were receiving a new treatment that might shrink their tumors.
They lied to them.
They completely lied. In reality, the patients were placed in lead-lined rooms and subjected to total body irradiation.
Massive, searing doses of radiation.
Yes, radiation that caused agonizing nausea, vomiting, and essentially destroyed their bone marrow. The Pentagon wasn't trying to cure their cancer. They were using the patients' bodies to calibrate their Cold War radiation tables.
And the consciousness of guilt is right there in the paperwork. The lead researcher specifically hid the names of the patients in his reports to the Pentagon.
He only used their initials.
He explicitly noted that he was anonymizing the data so that the patients or their families could never connect themselves to the study, specifically to avoid future litigation and bad press. He knew exactly what he was doing was indefensible.
That same arrogance, that assumption that the scientist knows best and the patient is merely a vessel for data, is perfectly illustrated by Dr. Chester Southam at the prestigious Sloan Kettering Institute in 1952.
Let's talk about Southam.
Southam was an immunologist trying to understand if cancer could be transmitted like a virus and how the immune system reacted to foreign cancer cells.
And to do this, he needed live cancer cells. So he used HeLa cells.
Right. HeLa cells are perhaps the most famous biological material in history.
They were taken from a young Black woman named Henrietta Lacks in 1951.
Without her knowledge or consent, shortly before she died of cervical cancer. Normal human cells have a built-in expiration date. They divide a certain number of times and then die. But Henrietta Lacks' cancer cells had a mutation that kept an enzyme called telomerase active.
Meaning they never stopped dividing.
Never. They were the world's first immortal human cell line.
They were aggressive, infinitely reproducing human cancer cells. And Dr. Southam decided to see what happens when you inject them into a living person.
He went to the Ohio State Penitentiary and injected live HeLa cells directly into the arms of the inmates to see if tumors would grow.
Which is horrifying enough on its own. But he didn't stop with the prisoners. Southam proceeded to inject live HeLa cancer cells into over 300 perfectly healthy women who had come to his clinic for routine gynecological care.
Just unbelievable.
He intentionally injected healthy women with aggressive, immortal cancer cells, and he didn't tell them what he was doing. When he was later caught and questioned about why he didn't ask for their consent, his defense was that he didn't want to cause undue panic.
Undue panic. He believed his right to satisfy his scientific curiosity superseded their right to know they were being infected with a lethal disease.
As dark and disturbing as these American experiments are, the orphans, the prisoners, the unsuspecting patients, the soldiers, they represent a slow, corrosive erosion of ethics. But the historical sources warn us that when a state entirely removes the rights of the individual,
And strip everything away.
yeah, when a government legally declares that certain demographics of humans are nothing more than biological material to be used and discarded, the result is an apocalyptic catastrophe. To see the absolute bottom of this ethical abyss, we have to examine the medical establishment of Nazi Germany.
Right. When we look at Nazi Germany, we are not looking at a few rogue, mad scientists operating in secret basements.
It wasn't a fringe movement.
No, we are looking at the complete, terrifying mobilization of a nation's entire medical and scientific infrastructure for racial and military ends. This was state-sponsored science, heavily funded and enthusiastically supported by the most prestigious academic organizations in the country, like the German Research Fund and the Kaiser Wilhelm Society.
The scale of the medical atrocities is so vast it almost defies comprehension. And it's crucial to understand that it didn't start with the infamous concentration camp experiment.
It started quietly.
It started in the pristine wards of civilian hospitals and psychiatric asylums.
The prelude to the Holocaust was a medical operation known as Action T4. This was the Nazi regime's systematic euthanasia program, aimed at purging the German population of the physically and mentally disabled, the psychiatrically ill, and anyone deemed biologically unfit.
But Action T4 wasn't just an extermination program. It was treated as a massive research opportunity.
The pharmaceutical industry saw the doomed patients as an endless supply of test subjects. Massive chemical giants like IG Farben arranged to have experimental drug preparations tested on asylum patients who were already legally marked for death.
The records show they tested highly toxic compounds like B1012, B1034, and Rutinol on these vulnerable people, just carefully noting the toxic side effects before the patients were ultimately murdered.
And once the patients were killed, often by lethal injection or starvation, their bodies were immediately looted by the academic establishment.
It's just sickening.
We have the meticulous records of neuropathologist Julius Hallervorden. He actively collaborated with the executioners. He would walk the wards of the psychiatric hospitals, examining the children and adults, and literally pick out the patients whose symptoms interested him.
He was shopping.
He was. He knew they were going to be gassed,
Hmm.
and he gave instructions on how to preserve their brains so they could be shipped directly to his laboratory for dissection.
He was browsing living human beings like books in a library, just waiting for them to be murdered so he could add their brains to his collection.
And as the war escalated, this marriage of murder and medicine moved into the concentration camps, operating under the ultimate excuse: military necessity.
Let's talk about Dachau.
Right. At the Dachau concentration camp, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had a very practical problem. Their pilots were being shot down over the freezing waters of the North Sea and dying of hypothermia before they could be rescued.
So they commanded Dr. Sigmund Rescher to find out exactly how long a man could survive in freezing water and what the most effective methods were for rewarming him.
To understand the sheer cruelty of these experiments, we have to look at the physiology of hypothermia.
What happens when you freeze?
When a human body is plunged into ice water, the blood vessels in the extremities violently constrict. It's called vasoconstriction. The body is trying to keep the warm blood in the core to protect the heart and brain.
Okay, so it sacrifices the limbs.
Exactly. As the core temperature plummets, the nervous system begins to fail. Victims experience profound confusion, muscle rigidity, and agonizing pain as ice crystals actually begin to form in the tissues, eventually leading to cardiac arrest.
The archives provide the specific, haunting story of a man named Iwan Adju. He was a Soviet partisan fighter captured by the Germans.
Dr. Rascher's team stripped Adju naked and plunged him into a massive tank of ice water right in the Dachau courtyard.
They hooked him up to rudimentary monitoring equipment and simply watched him freeze to death.
They kept him in the water, just monitoring his fading vitals and dropping body temperature, until a layer of ice literally formed on the surface of the water around his neck.
They took him right to the absolute brink of cardiac arrest.
Miraculously, Adju survived the initial freezing. But the brutal treatment and the subsequent agonizing attempts to rapidly rewarm him caused severe tissue damage and necrosis. The infection was so massive that he eventually lost a leg.
And the tragic, infuriating coda to Adju's story is that decades after the war, he applied to the West German government for compensation for his torture.
And they denied his claim.
They denied it. Their bureaucratic rationale was that the freezing experiment itself didn't permanently affect his earning capacity as much as his status as a prisoner of war did.
It is a breathtaking continuation of bureaucratic cruelty.
Dachau also hosted the infamous seawater experiments. The German Navy wanted to know if sailors stranded in life rafts could survive by drinking chemically processed seawater. Dr. Wilhelm Bigelbeck oversaw these tests.
And drinking seawater is a physiological death sentence.
Absolutely.
Right.
Because it comes down to osmosis.
Right. Seawater has a much higher concentration of salt than human blood. When you drink it, your body desperately tries to dilute the massive influx of salt. So it pulls water out of your own cells and into your bloodstream.
Your cells literally shrink and dehydrate.
Yes. Your kidneys go into overdrive trying to filter the salt, producing urine that requires even more water, which just accelerates the dehydration. It causes hypernatremia, leading to severe cramps, extreme delirium, kidney failure, and a prolonged, agonizing death.
Bigelbeck selected 40 Roma individuals. These were gypsies who had just been transferred from the extermination machinery of Auschwitz to Dachau, and he forced them to consume nothing but chemically altered salt water for weeks.
The suffering documented in the logs is unimaginable.
One victim, a man named Jacob Bamberger, miraculously survived for 12 days, receiving a daily ration of only half a liter of this toxic salt water.
The prisoners were driven so mad by the cellular dehydration that witnesses reported seeing them licking the dirty floors of the barracks. They were trying to suck moisture out of the cleaning rags just to soothe their throats.
Let's pause and consider the fundamental inversion of reality here.
It's a complete inversion.
The entire premise of the doctor-patient relationship is built on a foundation of trust and healing. You go to a doctor because you believe they possess the knowledge to alleviate your suffering. The Nazi medical establishment took that sacred dynamic and weaponized it.
The doctor in the white coat was no longer a healer. He was an engineer of agony. He viewed the human being on the table as a collection of spare parts or a living test tube.
That inversion is the terrifying core of our deep dive today. The German state legally defined targeted groups: Jews, Roma, Soviet POWs, homosexuals, the disabled as subhuman. They systematically stripped away their citizenship, their legal rights, and their humanity.
And once the law declared them expendable, the medical community enthusiastically embraced them as a limitless free supply of laboratory animals.
And while the freezing and seawater tests were at least twisted attempts to solve actual military logistical problems, the archives reveal that many of the experiments conducted in the camps had zero therapeutic or military intent whatsoever.
None. They were purely driven by racial ideology, pseudoscience, and breathtaking cruelty.
Which brings us to a profound concept coined by Dr. Leo Alexander. He was a key medical investigator and author of the medical reports for the Nuremberg trials. When he reviewed the mountains of bloody paperwork left behind by the SS doctors, he realized that the word medicine no longer applied.
He had to invent a new word.
He coined a new term, catinology.
Catinology, from the Greek word katino, meaning to kill, the science of killing.
Not the science of healing, the science of destruction.
Precisely. These doctors weren't practicing medicine in any recognizable ethical sense. They were using the sophisticated tools of medicine, scalpels, syringes, X-ray machines, pharmacology, pathology to enact genocide and systematic torture. They were optimizing the mechanics of death.
The examples of this catinology are deeply disturbing. Consider Dr. Kurt Heismeyer, who operated out of the Neuendemek concentration camp.
Heismeyer was a pediatrician by training.
But he was completely obsessed with proving a bizarre, scientifically baseless racial theory. He believed that tuberculosis was not simply an infectious bacterial disease, but rather a manifestation of racial inferiority. He theorized that superior Aryan bodies reacted to TB differently than inferior Jewish bodies.
It's complete nonsense. But to prove this utterly fabricated theory, he requested test subjects. And the SS provided him with 20 Jewish children, aged 5 to 12.
Little kids.
Heismeyer took these healthy children and intentionally injected live, virulent tuberculosis bacilli directly into their lungs and lymph nodes.
And then he surgically removed their infected lymph nodes without anesthesia, just to study the disease's progression.
He knowingly gave 20 children a lethal, agonizing respiratory disease just to satisfy his racist curiosity.
And the horror of Heismeyer's catinology didn't end in the laboratory. In April 1945, as the British forces were rapidly advancing and liberating the camps, Heismeyer and the SS command realized that these 20 sick, mutilated children were living, breathing evidence of a horrific war crime.
They had to hide the evidence.
To cover their tracks, The SS transported the 20 children to an empty school building in Hamburg called Bullenhuser Dam. They took them down into the basement, injected them with morphine to sedate them, and hung all 20 children from hooks on the wall, silencing them forever to protect a medical career.
It is the ultimate betrayal of the pediatric oath.
Then we look at the Ravensbrück concentration camp, which was primarily a camp for women. Here, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, a prominent orthopedic surgeon and the personal physician to Heinrich Himmler, was trying to defend his surgical reputation.
Right, he had previously failed to save a high-ranking SS officer who died of gas gangrene. And Gebhardt wanted to prove that his surgical techniques were correct and that the new sulfa drugs were ineffective.
To prove his point, Gebhardt designed what he called the Silk Rain operations. He selected healthy, young Polish women political prisoners, known in the camp as the rabbits.
He strapped them to operating tables and intentionally shattered the bones in their legs.
And to simulate battlefield wounds, he didn't just break the bones. He took cultures of streptococcus, tetanus, and the bacteria that causes gas gangrene and rubbed them directly into the shattered marrow.
Gas gangrene is a horrific infection. The bacteria produce toxins that literally rot the flesh from the inside, producing gas that swells the tissue until it splits open.
Gebhardt even ordered glass shards and wood splinters to be ground deep into the women's muscles to mimic shrapnel.
Once the women were dying of massive sepsis and gangrene, he tested various drugs or simply amputated the limbs or surgically removed entire sections of muscle and nerve tissue to see if they would regenerate.
The agony was absolute. But amidst this total darkness, the archives also preserve the incredible, defiant bravery of the victims.
Yes, we have to mention the story of Władysława Kierleska.
She was a Polish political prisoner who survived 2 of these horrific bone-shattering operations. Despite being mutilated, feverish, and entirely at the mercy of the SS, she bravely confronted the camp commandant.
She boldly protested the experiments, defiantly stating that under international law, they had no right to physically mutilate political prisoners.
Her courage in the face of absolute tyranny is a testament to the human spirit.
But tragically, her protest could not stop the machinery of chicanology. In Auschwitz Block 10, the focus shifted to the systematic destruction of the future. Dr. Karl Kloberg was tasked directly by Himmler to find a cheap, fast, and mass-producible method to sterilize millions of undesirable women,
so they could be used as slave labor without the inconvenience of them reproducing.
Kloberg's method was monstrous. He would force women into gynecological chairs and, without any anesthesia, inject caustic, burning chemical liquids, often formaldehyde derivatives, directly through their cervixes into their uteruses.
The chemicals burned the delicate tissues, causing massive inflammation that effectively glued the fallopian tube shut, permanently and agonizingly destroying their reproductive organs.
Concurrently, in a pristine anatomical institute in Berlin, Dr. Hermann Steve was conducting his own ghoulish research on the female reproductive system. Steve wanted to understand the physiological effects of extreme, chronic stress on ovulation and menstruation.
Think of the human endocrine system like an incredibly delicate, complex clockwork mechanism. It relies on a perfect balance of hormones to regulate the reproductive cycle. Steve wanted to know what happens to that clockwork when you hit it with the sledgehammer of absolute mortal terror.
His test subjects were young women who had been arrested for political resistance and sentenced to death by the Gestapo.
Steve would intentionally manipulate their terror. He would cruelly tell a woman the exact date and time of her execution, and then carefully document how the psychological shock altered her menstrual cycle.
Once the Gestapo executed the woman, often by guillotine, her still warm body was rushed directly to Steve's dissection table so he could examine the physical damage the stress had done to her ovaries.
It is pure sadism cloaked in the respectable veneer of a lab coat. But perhaps the most glaring, undeniable example of catanology, the experiment that perfectly distills the intersection of medicine and genocide, is the Jewish skeleton collection.
This project was conceived by Dr. August Hirt. He was a professor of anatomy at the Rijksuniversiteit at Strasbourg. Hirt fully believed the Nazi propaganda that the Jewish race was going to be completely exterminated.
Therefore, as an anatomist, he felt an academic urgency to create an anatomical museum collection of this soon-to-be extinct race for future university students to study.
He didn't want plaster casts. He wanted real bones. Hirt specifically ordered 115 Jewish inmates from Auschwitz to be transferred to the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp. These individuals were selected precisely for their physical characteristics.
A gas chamber was specially constructed at Natzweiler for the sole, explicit purpose of murdering these 115 people so that their fresh corpses could be quickly transported to Hertz University Laboratory.
His plan was to deflesh their bodies in vats of chemicals and mount their skeletons in the university halls.
When we look back at Hurt, Klauberg, Gebhardt, and Heismeyer, we see them unequivocally as monsters. But the truly terrifying historical reality is that they saw themselves as pioneers.
They did. They were ambitious academics. They published papers on their findings, presented their research at prestigious medical conferences, and received promotions.
Which raises a profoundly difficult question. How did the global medical community react when the war finally ended, the camp gates were thrown open, and the Allied investigators finally saw the bloody paperwork? How does the world process a betrayal of this magnitude?
That leads us to the reckoning. The immediate post-war period forced the international medical, scientific, and legal communities to confront the men in the white coats. This confrontation culminated in the doctors' trial, the Nuremberg medical trial held in 1946 and 1947.
23 defendants, the vast majority of them holding medical degrees, were put on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. To understand the complex science and build the case, the prosecution relied heavily on American medical experts to evaluate what had happened in those camps.
Two of the key American medical experts brought in to evaluate the evidence were Dr. Andrew Ivy and the aforementioned Dr. Leo Alexander.
They sat in the courtroom and reviewed the meticulous logs of horror, the freezing temperatures, the sterilization formulas, the deliberate pathogen infections.
During the trial, several of the Nazi doctors actually tried to mount a defense based on utilitarianism. They argued that military necessity justified their actions.
They argued that if sacrificing a few doomed prisoners yielded data that saved thousands of German soldiers, their actions were logically and ethically sound.
But Dr. Andrew Ivy decisively shut down that defense. He testified forcefully against this utilitarian math. He stated, and I'm quoting from the trial transcript, "There's no justification in killing 5 people in order to save the lives of 500. There is no state or politician under the sun who could force me to perform a medical experiment which I thought was morally unjustified."
The revulsion at the sheer scale of the abuses revealed during this trial birthed one of the most important documents in modern history, the Nuremberg Code. It was the first international document to explicitly and forcefully lay out the ethical rules for human experimentation.
The very first principle of the Nuremberg Code is absolute and uncompromising. It states that the voluntary, informed consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. It mandates that the subject must have the legal capacity to give consent, must be free from any coercion or duress, and must fully comprehend the risks involved.
The Nuremberg Code paved the way for policies in the United States, like the 1953 Wilson Directive, which established the absolute necessity of informed consent for all military research.
Looking at this timeline, it feels like a triumph of ethics.
It does. Humanity stared into the darkest abyss imaginable, saw what happens when science abandons morality, and wrote an ironclad rulebook to make sure we never went back.
That is the comforting narrative we like to tell ourselves. But this is where the historical record presents a striking, deeply uncomfortable, and profound irony. Let's look closely at Dr. Leo Alexander, the man who helped draft the Nuremberg Code, the man who looked at the Nazis and coined the term chitonology.
He's one of the architects of modern medical ethics. What did he do?
We have to examine a fundamental philosophical clash between the ancient Hippocratic Oath and modern research ethics.
Okay.
The Hippocratic Oath basically states that a doctor should do no harm and that their primary duty is to the well-being of the patient sitting in front of them. Dr. Alexander relied heavily on this ancient code. He believed that as long as a doctor's ultimate intent was to help, their actions were ethically sound.
But treating a patient's illness is fundamentally different than conducting scientific research to gather data.
Exactly. Because Dr. Alexander conflated treating a patient with conducting research, he easily rationalized his own experimental work. The archives reveal that during the war, before he went to Nuremberg, Dr. Alexander himself experimented on British aviation pilots without their informed consent.
What?
He exposed them to dangerous, extreme conditions to test aviation physiology.
Wait, the man prosecuting the Nazis for experimenting on people without their consent was himself experimenting on Allied pilots without their consent. The hypocrisy is staggering.
He genuinely believed that because his ultimate goal was to benefit the Allied war effort and save pilots' lives in the long run, he didn't need their permission. He couldn't see the profound difference between a doctor treating a patient's best interests and a researcher using a human subject to test a scientific hypothesis.
So, by relying purely on his personal interpretation of good intent, he conducted research that would have been completely illegal under the very Nuremberg Code he helped create a few years later.
It perfectly illustrates the danger of relying on a scientist's subjective intent.
It's as if we built a massive, impenetrable fortress of ethical rules after World War II, but we kept leaving the back door wide open whenever it was convenient for national security, or whenever a scientist felt their ambition was justified by the greater good. The timeline is damning.
It really is.
The United States condemned Nazi science at Nuremberg in 1947, yet concurrently ran the MK-Ultra LSD experiments on unsuspecting citizens, and Dr. Southam injected prisoners in Ohio with live cancer cells in the 1950s.
It forces us to synthesize a very difficult core theme of this entire deep dive. Ethical guidelines, no matter how beautifully written, and legal codes, no matter how strict, are only as strong as the society that is willing to enforce them.
If a society fundamentally believes that certain groups, prisoners, the disabled, soldiers, or marginalized minorities, are somehow lesser citizens who owe a debt or are expendable,
Then those beautiful rules will inevitably be bent, reinterpreted, or ignored to exploit them.
and the sources we are looking at today prove that this injustice isn't just a relic of the 1940s or the Cold War. It lingers today in how we manage the historical record, specifically in how we treat the memory of the victims. Paul Weinling's exhaustive research highlights a really frustrating modern philosophical issue regarding the Nazi experiments.
Weinling spent years scouring European archives trying to identify the victims of the camp experiments. But he points out that modern German archives often use strict data protection and medical privacy laws to actively anonymize the victims of these historical atrocities.
In official modern records, victims who were tortured and murdered are frequently referred to only by their initials.
So if you look up the records of the 20 children murdered at Bullenhezergam, a child who was intentionally injected with tuberculosis and hanged in a basement is reduced to child AB.
The archives claim they are doing this to protect the child's medical privacy, but they're dead, and they were murdered.
The bureaucratic argument is that medical records are perpetually sacred. But Weinling and many other historians argue passionately against this. They argue that this bureaucratic anonymization actually inflicts a second trauma.
It obscures the identities of the murdered, essentially erasing them from the historical record.
Right. By hiding their names to protect privacy, the archives are ultimately protecting the legacies of the medical institutions and the perpetrators who committed the crimes, shielding them from the full, named reality of their actions.
It is a massive ethical tension. Do you blindly follow a blanket rule about a victim's privacy, or do you have a higher ethical duty to shout their name from the rooftops so they aren't lost to history?
By hiding their names behind initials, it feels like we are extending the exact dehumanization the Nazi doctors started.
The Nazis treated them as biological numbers, and now the modern archives treat them as alphabetical initials.
It requires us to constantly question our motives, even when we think we are following the rules. Are we truly protecting the victim, or are we quietly protecting ourselves and our institutions from the deep discomfort of acknowledging our own history?
Okay, we need to pull all of these threads together. We have gone on an incredibly intense, dark journey today. We started with what looked like the innocent development of agricultural bug spray to feed the world and the desperate hunt for malaria pills to win a war against fascism.
But we traced how that relentless drive for scientific knowledge, when unchecked by absolute respect for human autonomy, led to the horrific abuses of state power.
We saw the exploitation of the desperate and the vulnerable in U.S. prisons and orphanages, the betrayal of soldiers, and we plunged into the absolute nightmare of kinology, the science of killing in the Nazi concentration camps.
We have seen, unequivocally, that science does not operate in a sterile moral vacuum. The laboratory is deeply shaped by the political prejudices and social values of the era.
When a society decides that certain people are expendable, science will inevitably and often enthusiastically be used to exploit them.
The data we rely on today carries the ghost of that exploitation.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought. The next time you apply a prescription skin cream, or you take an everyday anti-malarial medication for a vacation, or you read an article about a new breakthrough in extreme human physiology, take a moment to consider the invisible, unconsenting pioneers.
Think about the prisoners in Stateville, the orphans in Philadelphia, the soldiers at Edgewood.
And the victims of authoritarian terror in Dachau and Ravensbrück who bore the agonizing physical cost of that data. Their unconsenting suffering is permanently woven into the fabric of modern medicine.
And that reality leaves us with a final provocative question that medical ethicists still debate today. The global medical community currently possesses incredibly valuable anatomical, physiological, and pharmacological data derived directly from these historical atrocities.
We know how the human body reacts to freezing, to extreme stress, to specific toxins, only because people were tortured to provide that data.
If a doctor uses that tainted data to save a patient's life tomorrow, are we honoring the victims who suffered to provide it, or are we quietly, practically validating the methods of their tormentors?